about found their seats yet? Sit down, Stan. Okay. Sit down, Sam. Well, the next person that we're going to have present today has been a dear friend for many, many years, and as I said not too long ago, Larry Hush. I have insinuated myself in just about every project Ken's ever done. So bless his heart, he can't announce any kind of project, but what I show up and get in the middle of it, and I'm really grateful for all those opportunities. Ken is a educator and a filmmaker, and there are some films that just made it to History Fix, which is a streaming service. I think it's a new service, isn't it? It's a new company. And The Road to Valhalla, which I'm in, and Home on the Range, which Mary's got a special place in her heart for, are on History Fix now. And they are being very well received. Road to Valhalla, I think, has been on there for 3 or 4 weeks, and it is getting a lot of attention. And Home on the Range was just added this past week, and so we're very excited about that and all the other things. And Ken's got some new film projects going on this summer, and I think he'll tell you about those. But Ken is a wonderful historian and a very inspiring person, and my dear friend. And please make welcome Ken Spurgeon.
Well, thank you. My running joke when I'm not speaking at school is that I'm not used to people looking at me when I talk. That's not true. I got a lot of students that do look at me when I talk, especially after the halfway point of the semester. In the last 2 weeks, I'm really popular. Everybody who teaches knows what I'm talking about. So, so ironically, one of the things that I thought about when doing a subject like this, so many thoughts come to my mind, because a lot of times I'm talking about specific groups or stories or tribes. And even last night, before I kind of finished it up, I was thinking to myself, it's a survey. It's almost like a survey. So I'm giving you a bit of an overview, even though I'm going to talk about a few specific stories, but I'm giving you a little bit of an overview of the immigrant tribes of Kansas. And since I'm a teacher, I teach at Friends University, but I was a high school history teacher for a long time. And I'm also in charge of Kansas History Day for our district in Wichita. And one of the things, when you go through all those things, you see they give you all the points you got to hit. You know, I try not to teach to test ever. I try. But, they tell you, usually it's smart, here's what we need to hit. When you get to this, whether you're doing U.S. history, or sometimes even if I teach a class called History of the American West. I also teach Kansas history. But very rarely is this addressed at all, even in the more specific discussions. So it's important. Everything we've heard, we've already heard 2 great talks today. And so much of what I hear, I'm thinking, I wish people knew that. I wish they understood that. I wish they read about that. I could go on a diatribe about that. I could talk about that for a while, because sometimes, and this will be the last part of my introductory sermon, we've turned a lot of things into caricatures of things instead of real history. We're not digging deep. We've got a name and we have an association. And so that's too bad. So we're going to talk about immigrant tribes of Kansas, and I'm going to kind of focus, like I said, it'll be kind of general, but I'm going to focus on the period 1829 to 1854, really. And I hope I at least say some things you've not heard before. And I certainly don't know everything about them. That's the one thing I do know about this subject. It's complicated. It's big. That's why it's amazing we don't know more, because this is a big topic. So that was my prelude a little bit. But so usually when we talk about Indian removal, tribal removal in the Americans in the early 19th century, what we usually do is we talk about, understandably, but we talk about these 5 tribes that come to Oklahoma Indian Territory. We all know about them. They were all significant tribes. They were all large in size and scope. And they had a very sad forced removal. We all know this. And of course, we've heard the phrase Trail of Tears quite a bit. I think Deb might have called me out earlier, but my parents grew up in Oklahoma. My mother was born near Kearney, Oklahoma. My father was born near Stillwater, Oklahoma, and I still own the farm in Stillwater. So I was raised in Kansas, but I do feel like a half-breed a little bit. I've got a lot of Oklahoma in me. I know my areas of Oklahoma quite well. And so this part of the story is interesting to me. It is something that's near and dear to me too. But again, I'm a Kansan and I grew up here, and what's rarely talked about is the part we're going to talk about today. So this is an important story. I'm not trying to downplay this at all, but it's one part of the story. So what we don't know is, back to context, we don't know the bigger picture of this discussion, which was the Native American land cessions that existed pre-1829. I'm using that as a marker year because of the Kansas part of the story. But we don't know the Native American land cession discussions pre-1829 and post-1829. Again, in my brain, I'm going pre-1829, and then I'm going to go 1829 to 1854 because of the establishment of Kansas Territory. And I may make some references past that point, but I won't go past that point very much. So that's what I want to talk about. So now when you look at this map, again, we're used to seeing the Indian Removal Act map connected right to the Trail of Tears, which is typically the 5 tribes from the American South, and I get that. But you can see even looking at this, and I'm sorry that that's a little bit fuzzy, but we have to realize the removals are happening pretty nonstop from the founding of the country. They're coming in different forms. There were attempts and discussions of voluntary removals, but of course many of them were forced removals, and forced removals come in lots of different forms. They don't come in like one shape and one size. So it can be pretty complicated, but you can see this one here, which gets us to about 1830. You can see all the different movements that have occurred as the U.S. nation is more and more populated. We've heard references to his name, Deb made them, but my professors at Wichita State were Dr. Miner and Dr. Unruh. I studied under Dr. Unruh, and so I knew those guys really quite well. I was fortunate. And I went back to Unruh's writings this week because I thought, get back into that again and start thinking through some of the things that he said again. And one of the things that he would talk about quite often is what we're talking about right now, which is how did this come about? There wasn't one day, a moment where everybody sat down at a presidential cabinet or whatever else and said, we're going to do it like this, go. Didn't happen like that. It evolved before there was a U.S. Y'all know that. I'm sure you know that. But it was happening in the 1600s. It was happening in the 1700s. It was already happening. The question was, how was it going to get codified or legalized or justified or all of that? So again, I won't go too deep into that, but you all know that that's part of this backstory. Now let's turn our attention to Kansas. And this is complicated. I don't know if I should write on the slide what I wrote on the slide, but I did, which is the idea of who was the first to really be removed to Kansas. And the reason why that's complicated is because I think the first time I see it mentioned is 1824 or 1825. The first time, I guess, quote unquote, they are told to move, being moved, etc., is this tribe. And I did go back, and I thought to myself, let me see if my other fellow historians agree with that. Several did, that the Delaware or the Lenape were the first to really be moved to what becomes Kansas. Of course, it's not Kansas yet at this point, but the Delaware themselves had, like all these tribes, had been moved multiple times. The most recent treaties that are applicable to the discussion of their removal to Kansas is the 1804 and the 1818 treaty. One of the historians that I read recently talked about the fact that several of the tribes that come to Kansas are small in number proportionally, and that ends up having a factor on their ability to even resist. There's some truth in that, but that's not completely true. Some of these tribes were pretty strong. not all of them came 100% to Kansas. In other words, they might have been told, you're moving. In some cases, I'm thinking of the Kickapoo, they're going to end up flaring out a little bit and not all coming to Kansas. But the Delaware were first. They initially, as they get closer to Kansas in the 1820s, they're put to the area of southwest Missouri. They clash with the Osage. Those clashes are what leads to the 1829 move of the Delaware to Kansas. I forgot one thing I was going to tell you. This was something, again, I asked myself, what was the first time anybody at a presidential level or a legislative level said we're going to get them moved? West of the Mississippi even. First time I see it mentioned is 1803, President Jefferson. It's not law, but President Jefferson does say in 1803 that he's asking almost for a voluntary removal of these tribes west of the Mississippi. So this is the process now finally in action. But Jefferson mentions it. So encounters with the Osage leads the Delaware to Kansas. First of what we call the Emigrant with an E tribes here. I just wanted to show you this graphic because their moves were multiple. Y'all know, I'm sure you know that. And you could say this about many tribes, right? But their moves were multiple. And so just to get a feel from point of origin to where they're going to end up. And I know there was, of course, many of these tribes that are going to come to Kansas will end up in Oklahoma one way or the other later. One of the things about, and this is a good chance for me to say a little bit about sources. Obviously, 90%, 95% of our sources in this whole discussion come from who? Whites, Indian agents, government legislation, right? So that does become problematic. And if you're trying to dig into this a little deeper, we really want to hear from the people that were moved. And I tried really hard today to at least mention some names. So even if you wanted to go look later, you go, hey, I want to know more about the Shawnee or whatever else. Who could I look up? And so there are some families that certainly, in fact, when Deb mentioned this, Charles Curtis's family would be people in Charles Curtis's family. At least there's some sources. With some of these stories, there's not hardly any native sources at all. But anyway, have you heard of this name before, the Grinters? Of course, they're famous because of Grinter Place, the home that some of us have seen. You'll see it here in a minute. But she's also part Delaware, and so she's going to marry Moses Grinter. Annie also lives a very, very long life. They have a substantial home. There were several tribes that when they initially come, Delaware were part of them, they end up in places like Wyandotte County. Many of us have heard Shawnee Mission. In fact, I'm teaching Kansas history this semester, and our football quarterback at Friends is from Shawnee, and he went to Shawnee Mission South or something high school, and I was doing something like this, and I started talking about it, and he goes, and he's a history major. He's going to be a teacher in a year. Don't judge him. But after class, he said, Mr. Spurgeon, I'm sorry I didn't put it together. He goes, I live like 5 miles from there. I didn't put it together. I said, you didn't realize that? And he goes, no. And I said, you're all right. You know it now. And so he was pretty excited because he realized that was right in my backyard, So, but anyway, we do know quite a bit about this particular family because of Annie and Moses. And if you've never been there before, you should go to see it. There's the house today. Speaking of filming, we filmed there once. I'm pretty sure this is the oldest structure, oldest home in the county. But anyway, here's Moses, who didn't live quite as long as Annie. But we do have some sources from them and some accounts of them. And of course, the Delaware weren't treated well, like so many. And of course, later on, the Delaware were moved to Oklahoma. There still are Delaware in Kansas. They are called Kansas Delaware or Citizen Delaware. I'll get to some of this later. But when we're going to have this 1829 to 1854 people, how many Native Americans were pushed to Kansas? Over 10,000. How many were left after 1854? About 1,000. Now those numbers are going to change, and of course the way we calculate and do that is going to change as well. These are the tribes. You can see why it's a big story, right? These are all the tribes from 1829 to 1854 that are relocated to Kansas. So 25 years, and I mean, there's some I can say a lot about. We're going to see a couple of maps in a minute. I love maps. They help me to understand things, of course. I know I'm in the right crowd for map loving, right? It's like there should be just a map loving club because I love them. But anyway, these are not all of them, but these are the majority of tribes. By the way, Franklin County Historical Society has a talk like in a week or two about the Muncie, which is one I don't know as much about. I mean, it's one of the ones I know the least about. But there are certainly people who can talk to us about that. But anyway, these are the tribes. Now, when we get to the point of actual reservations in Kansas Territory, you'll see a map in a minute, but it's quite a few. It's close to 20 that are going to get a reservation. Some of them have a reservation that only lasts 10 years. Some it's a little bit longer. But anyway, these are all the tribes that came to the area, were forced to the area. So the number's around 10,000. That's not an exact, of course, but that's the roughly. Now, some people have said the next 2 or 3 tribes that came, and I started to do this and just say it to you, but I just wanted to show you this for a second because the Kickapoo tribe, the Iowa tribe, the Sac and Fox tribe, these tribes, several of them are going to come from the upper Midwest, Great Lakes region, okay? And the 1830s is the busy period. This is when it's really happening. Of course, right? We had the Indian Removal Act. We also have legislation in 1834 that amps it up a whole nother notch. When we're talking about the Indian Removal Act, it's both President Jackson and it's the Congress, and I know you all know that. And it's also Andrew Jackson overriding the will of the Supreme Court too. But it was unfortunately, sadly, and wrongly, it was the majority of Americans who wanted to get him out one way or another, who wanted to push him. And but anyway, I just wanted you to know this is really the clear out of the Great Lakes. You can almost look at the tribes that are in these areas and say the removal for them that's outlined is directly connected to the year of statehood. You can watch it. Like I could say a tribe, and if I said a year, you'll see some years in a minute. If I said a year, I can almost guarantee you they're 3 to 5 years away from statehood. So the process is connected. And unfortunately, that's the story of Kansas. Removing them is connected to Kansas getting statehood. Even if that's not spoken or said, it's what's happening. So here's a little bit better map, and here's now like let's drill in, and here's this 25-year period. This map says 1829 to 1850, but here's this 25-year period of the tribes really being moved. And I like this map because if I'm showing us like students for a second, I can say here's the southern removal, here's the northern removal. We've overlooked the northern removal, but you can see here they don't even have all of them. But what also is nice about this map is you can see some of the reservations in Kansas as they're outlined there. And I find that helpful. At least it's helpful to me as I consider it and think about it. I appreciated Dr. Blakesley's, what a treat to have him, by the way. No joke. I'm a Wichitan and I'm an admirer and he's a friend and I interviewed him last year, but what a treat to have him here. But I can't remember. I think it was him or I think it was him that said the Skeety branch of the Pawnee. And the next film we're going to do, the group we're portraying is the Skeety branch, but their specific story is so unique because they got moved so many times. And ironically, they end up in Oklahoma, and my grandmother was born on that reservation right near where the Skeety were at. And so, man, there's so many of those kind of stories where even to track your people is just such an amazing journey. And I'm glad we're partaking in it. Okay, this is an old map. I know it's hard for you to see. I want to blow it up. And if you want to see it later or if somebody wanted to post it later, you can. I'm going to probably go away from the mic a minute just to point at some things. But here we see the Pawnee, the Omaha in the present-day Nebraska. I like this map because it starts to fill in for us a handful of the earliest reservations of the 1830s. If you can see there, it's actually the Kickapoo, the Sac and Fox, the Delaware, the Kansas, the Kansa, and the Shawnee are listed here. Of course, the Kansa are already here. Osage are down at the bottom of the map as well. But I do like that early look at the map. Yeah, D.
What is the date of that map?
I said the 30s, but I don't know the exact date. I'm sorry. I can find it.
It says 36 at the bottom.
Okay. Did you hear that? 1836. Here's a zoom, a little bit better version, a little bit better view of this. And again, this is helpful to me because of understanding some of these earliest outlined areas. It's such a moving adventure here, such an evolving story. But again, the maps that Dr. Blakesley had up a minute ago, you can kind of see these things in relationship to some of those areas that he mentioned. By the way, they attempted so we've been talking about the Indian Removal Act and the legislation of 1834. They attempted in the late 1830s to count, and that's what you're seeing in some of these maps as well, which is, even though they're not completely accurate, they're very helpful in trying to study it. Okay, so here's an attempt of the group. So we talked about 30 tribes being moved here, immigrant tribes, right? This is really helpful, of course, as we try to look at it. It's also helpful because of the dates. I will say a lot of times what you see as a date of removal is not necessarily the date anybody arrived. And so if you're looking for, sometimes, like we talked about before, I said you can kind of almost see when they were taken out of a state, and then that state, for example, Iowa or whatever else, is 3 to 5 years from statehood. But it's not always exact, but it's close. It gives you a feel for things. Right on down here to, this is good because it gives us all the way right down to the Cherokee Strip here on the bottom, and the Quapaw in the lower right-hand corner. So I said I wanted to mention a few of the individuals that we do have sources from, because that's what kind of gets lost. And I won't go into detail. I mean, I could answer or try to answer some of those questions, but we do have some native accounts. So we're not completely without them. You know, again, if 95% of what we know is from the Indian agents and or legislators, but we do have some accounts. This may be the earliest account of any of those that was moved. This is a Shawnee chief named George Bluejacket. And you can read some of this, but this was really an early 1830s kind of quote-unquote history of the Shawnee people, where he tried to tell what has happened up till now. It's very informative. You can read some of this online. Some of it's at the Kansas State Historical Society. You can actually get some snapshots there, but you can see several pages of George Bluejacket's account. And it is the typical in the sense that he's saying we don't want to be moved again, honor our rights again, please. Here's our story. But it's helpful. It's very helpful. Here's one piece to the puzzle too. And I'm going to mention a gal to you in a minute in my notes. Sadly, a lot of times, of course, their requests and their pleas went unanswered. But also, a lot of times, those letters only went to the Indian agent. So they never got anywhere else. So even in cases where maybe somebody could have done something or would have done something, if that would have happened, oftentimes they did not leave the agent themselves. And we all know that story. That's a whole other talk to talk about Indian agents, because that's really a challenge. But anyway, so this is, to my knowledge, the first account from an Indian in Kansas. True written account, George Bluejacket. This is one that people know quite a bit about. It's pretty sad. And I told you I'm kind of giving you a survey view, an overview a bit. But I'd love to tell you this story in a little more detail. I'll tell you a little bit of it. But this was the removal of the Potawatomi. Many of us do know that name more commonly in eastern Kansas because of their continued presence and the Prairie Band and what have you. But this is what people call the Trail of Death, and this was September to November of 1838, and they did not go as the government wanted them to go. They went piecemeal, and eventually there was military that went and finally got the last real band and forced them to be moved. They traveled over 600 miles. This is a little bit more of the story. They traveled over 600 miles from Twin Lakes, Indiana to today's Osawatomie. The last band, which was under the grouping of Menominee, refused to go. They did go to get him. He did make it here. I was telling this to Deb yesterday. We're not even aware of the amount of leadership that ended up in Kansas, died in Kansas. Chiefs that we've all read about. It's like, wow. But anyway, so 600 members of the tribe were transported, 40 children, or 40 died along the way. They think the majority of them were children. So it was a pretty bad deal. Menominee made it here and died in Lynn County, Kansas in 1841. So the start of the Potawatomi, pretty tough. This is probably the most difficult forced removal in this story, is the Potawatomi. Sad deal. The Kickapoo, and again, I'm just picking a handful. We talked about being 30 tribes. I'm just picking a handful. But the way the removal of the Kickapoo is interesting. Again, a Great Lakes tribe that resided primarily near Lake Erie. They were moved as many as 8 or 10 times. They signed 10 treaties with the government in a period of about 1804 to about 1850, just treaty after treaty after treaty. You can see they were from Illinois to Missouri to Kansas to Oklahoma to Texas to Mexico. Now, that's partly because the Kickapoo actually broke up into 4 or 5 groupings. We still have a Kickapoo presence in Kansas today, but that's partly because they were broken up. Different bands went different directions depending upon what they had agreed to. We also know this, I'm sure, but oftentimes one band would agree to something and another one would not. That was true in the Potawatomi case as well, but that happened in the Kickapoo story. This is the bands today. If you weren't aware of that, there's the Kickapoo Kansas band, there's the Kickapoo Oklahoma band, a Texas band, and then there is a Mexican band of Kickapoo. So this is the Kickapoo story now, and that is the reservation today of the Kickapoo in Kansas. There are essentially 4. There's more than 4 tribes represented in Kansas, but if you Google it, you'll hear 4 because of 4 reserved areas, but there's more than that. I'm kind of going a little quick here, but and then the Iowa and the Sac and Fox, and you could just focus that down to the Sauk or the Sac and Fox, but they come through a treaty in 1842. They were primarily in Iowa. Iowa was about to be a state, or becoming a state, so the government was determined to get them out, and they did. This is 4 Sac and Fox chiefs. This is an interesting story because it was only signed by 2 or 3 people. A lot of times, maybe for ceremonial reasons, maybe to, justify it in their own brains, there were multiple signatures or signatories. In this case, it's the territorial governor of Iowa. It is one leader, which we know quite a bit about. You can learn more about, Keokuk. And then the President of the United States. This eventually gets sent to President Tyler, who was definitely no friend to Native Americans. Not a friend of Native Americans, but he signs it in 1843. But Keokuk he's the well-known chief that ends up coming. They have no choice. They're going to be forcibly removed if they don't move. There's a lot to say about Keokuk. And actually, there's a lot of photos of the family. And you and I were talking about this, Deb. There are some photos of a Keokuk in the 1850s and 1860s. That's actually the son of this gentleman. This gentleman his birth and death is about 1780 to about 1846, 1848. I may actually have it on the next slide, but he's amazing. He's in the War of 1812. We know a lot about this original Keokuk, and we have what's purported to be a daguerreotype of him that I'll show you in a second, but he's also painted by George Catlin here. So we know quite a bit about him. And again, he tried to resist. He's not going to win that battle. But here's this reported picture of Keokuk. You may have seen it. He ends up dying in Ottawa, Kansas. So, again, I almost think of, there's 4 or 5 chiefs that I can think of that end up in Kansas that are quite well known in earlier stories. Like I said, Keokuk's got an incredible story in the War of 1812. I was excited about this part because I thought nobody talks about this. So I want to say something about it real quick. And that's the role of missions. I may go off course a little bit. There are 2 books that I've read about missions, and ironically, my favorite one, I already talked about Dr. Miner and Dr. Unrau, who are my mentors, but going back to Joseph Herring's book was helpful, very helpful. But I found a few months ago a dissertation from the 70s. You guys know how that is. And this dissertation was extremely helpful and this guy went on to be a professor of history, but in his introduction, I thought, that's what I never hear. He said, oftentimes we study the Native American story in Kansas, the immigrant tribe story over here, and we study the mission history over here, but we really have a hard time putting it together. And this guy, his name is Mark Joy, but he basically digs in and says, I'm going to spend, and he also says, multiple tribes, lots of stories. I'm going to focus on about 5 that maybe have the more significant story. But he said, I'm going to try to understand this a little bit better. And the reason that I thought that was important is a couple of things. First of all, something I had not thought about before at all. He said we've not only done that, but we've also not understood them denominationally. He mentions that there were actually some tribes that had already had encounters with missionaries in other locations and had already moved themselves made some certain changes that way, get relocated to Kansas, and oh heck, you're not Methodist anymore, you're a Baptist now. And believe it or not, some of them said, what? That's not what we're doing. And that's true of their native religions as well. Of course, we know that one, but he just brought up several pieces of the puzzle that I had not thought about quite that same way before. But on top of that, also the fact that many times this was now the person that they could go to. Sometimes, of course, the church could help. I did, in one of the things he discusses in the study, of course, he discusses the things that go wrong, and we know about those. But he also discusses things like what was the religion, the specific denomination situation. How connected were they? How organized were they? By the way, no doubt about it, the Catholics were better organized. They were much better organized. Sometimes that ended up being helpful because there was a chain of command. A lot of times the Protestant denominations weren't very organized, and that sometimes just that alone hurt some native missions. So I just found that interesting. And he also talks about the fact that in that discussion, we want to see the specific missionary and what they might have thought or done. But when they write back east, or they write to the agent, are they writing on behalf, you all know this, but are they writing on behalf of the tribe, or are they writing on behalf of themselves? And I could spend time with that, right? But that happens a lot and a lot and a lot. I can't tell you that every time this happened, but a lot of times this happened. Mark Brooks will tell you this happened. They made sure they got some part of the deal. That happened almost every time. Again, can I say 100%? But they made sure they got some part of the deal. So that was interesting to me to just think about it in a different way. And I really appreciated that dissertation because it made me think. Now, there are some that we should talk about of these missionaries because they do have an impact. And one I wanted to mention is a man named Isaac McCoy. He established a series of Baptist missions. He's a fascinating guy. And I think a lot of times he's a likable guy. There's some things he did that are a little shaky. I did not like Mormons, did not like the Latter-day Saints at all, and ran amok of them multiple times. But he advocated for some good things at times too, very much so for some Native Americans. But he also wrote, you see this book here, in 1840, he writes a book that's very informational and very helpful called The History of Baptist Indian Missions in 1840. He writes in that book, you can discuss his motivation, but he writes in that book, if you're going to say that Native Americans should be moved, don't move them and then tell whites they can come anywhere around there. Leave them alone. He writes that in 1840. I mean, I didn't pull the exact account. He writes that in 1840. It's pretty amazing. He's saying, in other words, figure out where you're going to put us, leave us alone, protect us. And he says also in that book in 1840, when whites come in and start harassing and doing different things to not just Native Americans, but anybody that's on this reservation, it hurts us all. So anyway, he makes some pretty good advocacy for things. And one of McCoy's biographers said for him to write in 1840 some of the things he wrote is, you can see the quote, is somewhat breathtaking. And I could tell you more about McCoy. And again, he's not perfect. I'm not saying that. And there's a couple times I'm like, I'm not sure about your motivation there. In 1843, he, by the way, he argued that he was against slavery. I believe he was against slavery. But in 1843, he bought a slave. this recent biographer tracked this down, and he went and bought a woman in Missouri, and this biographer claims now he bought her for one specific reason. He knew her husband in Kansas who was free. He went and bought her, and he reunited the family. So there were several things that McCoy did that were out of the norm, above and beyond, and maybe nobody even knew about it. McCoy's son-in-law was Johnston Likens, and man, I could talk a lot about this because this has to do with Kansas City. McCoy and Likens both end up kind of being founders of Kansas Town, so to speak, but a bit of that. The community actually that they founded in Kansas City, as you know, Kansas City in those days was almost like a collection of 2 or 3 spaces instead of one connected city. But both of these guys were involved in the same work. McCoy lives a much longer life. Likens lives a much longer life. But anyway, these guys were unique for their time, different for their time. I don't know that I like Likens as much as I like his father-in-law, but they're both different than the average agent or missionary. So here's some of the missions that are still standing. I'm sure you all know this. I didn't grab them all, but here's the famous Shawnee Indian Mission that I told you my student was surprised to connect the dots. And then here's, Deb talked about it already today, right? This is the Shawnee, by the way, were Baptist. I don't know if I probably jumped ahead of that. The mission at Council Grove, although it changed, but it was Methodist. And it's a beautiful building. I love that building. And again, I'm trying to go fast because I know we're going to get to lunch. But I wanted to address this. So 1854 comes, the Kansas-Nebraska Act comes, and what we don't think about a lot of times is how abrupt this is for Native Americans in Kansas. They finally, these groups that were forced to be here between 1829 and 1854 are finally here. We have 19 or 20 reservations. In a minute, a piece of legislation is passed called the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And of course, you all know what that did. It opened up massive migration to Kansas for or against slavery. And here are all these Native Americans, right? And they're here. Here's what I think most of us do not think about at all. Do you think they were told, hey, in the next 2 to 5 years? No. The game was on. And people that I even like, politicians I might admire, I'll tell you about one in a second, didn't do the right thing here. It was overwhelming as all these migrants came into the area. So the Indian agent, George Minniepenny, plus Manifest Destiny, which a lot of Manifest Destiny is post-Mexican War, Kansas-Nebraska Act is certainly part of that. It's all in play. So what I'm saying is what we haven't thought about a lot of times, that in the Kansas story between 1854 and 1860, a tremendous amount of depredations and things done to Native Americans, more than we'll ever know. I'm not talking about necessarily attacks, but they are being infiltrated. People are settling on land right next to them, and they're like, wait a minute, I thought this was ours. That happens like crazy. I had one particular letter from a New York Indian written in 1857. This is a woman named Amelia Labita, and she wrote, "The settlers are settling all over our land." Right? Again, we don't even think about this. We think more about, and I'm not saying it's not important, but we think about the removals that are coming, the late 1860s, or maybe into the early 1870s a bit. But this is happening in the 1850s, right in the heart of bleeding Kansas. Weeks after John Brown is battling in blackjack, we have Native Americans who are being violated not too far away. Anyway, she writes, Amelia Labita writes, she's a New York Indian, and in 1857, she writes a letter that went no farther than her Indian agent, but she writes this letter where she says, the following things have occurred this last month, March of 1857. And she says, they are stealing from us, they're settling on our land, they don't have a land claim. She's claiming land rights. Like that's our land. You told us, right? And then she ends this letter and she says, I believe they are the worst people in the world. And those were people who were on both sides of the slavery question. They were violating the law. So the Native Americans are being overrun. And I use that word at the bottom because we always talk about Oklahoma, don't we, with Sooners, right? There's some Sooners in Kansas too. They were here too soon. So here's one of my heroes. I'm trying to write a book about him. And I love him. He's a great guy. He's not perfect, but he's a great guy. But guess what? He was one of those guys too. As much as I love him in the anti-slavery cause, he was speculating Native American land when he knew he should have waited. Now, I get why he was doing it. He's trying to beat out the pro-slavery guys. I get it. But he did it. And I know that is the problem, the challenge. He did his near Kansas City. Well, in what's today is Kansas City. What a lot of these guys realized is if they could find someone they could work with, guess what? An Indian agent, possibly someone who has native blood, they could maybe go into a partnership with them. Robinson was writing letters about this. He was writing to friends of his that were either native, he had a couple, or people who were working for the tribes. And so he was a land speculator, and he did make a lot of money for about a year before things got weird. And the guy he went into business with was a man named Abelard Guthrie. I don't know if you've ever heard this story, but it's fascinating to me. Abelard Guthrie was married to a woman named Quindaro Nancy. This is where we get the name for Quindaro, if you didn't know that. And this is the Wyandot tribe. Well, they start out as business. Well, you know what, Robinson was super smart. And so what he says is, let's go into business together, handshake, let's develop, let's speculate, let's sell lots. We'll sell lots of Wyandot land. Boom, let's go. Well, that sounded great, except for two problems. One, not supposed to be doing that. And two, what if this thing doesn't work? Who's going to pay the bill? According to Abelard Guthrie, for 2 years, Charles Robinson and him were making money. And then one day, financial problems, other people making land claims. There was disputed land claims. And suddenly Abelard Guthrie got stuck with a bill that he said Charles Robinson did not pay. He wanted to kill Charles Robinson over it. So this was the Wyandot tribe. And anyway, I just wanted to show you this picture too because a lot of people don't know the story of Quindaro. Quindaro later on, kind of famous for other things, but still around. The neighborhood is still around. Okay, I went kind of quick. But 4 reservations still in Kansas. Kickapoo and Potawatomi are the main ones people remember. I had the Kickapoo map up a minute ago. And then Iowa and Sac and Fox, which is on the Kansas-Nebraska border, kind of left to right. The Potawatomi, of those who resisted removal, the Potawatomi, the Prairie Band of the Potawatomi, might be the most interesting. They did realize they had some people around them who were helpful, and they made a very strong legal claim to fight and hold their land, and they were able to. Where we all know now the Prairie Band Casino's at, that's where they made their claim, north of Topeka. But these are the 4 tribes that still have reservations. But like I said, we still also have Citizen Delaware and others that have a number here still. I just wanted to go back to this map to end with, and one of my purposes in doing this is even as a survey, and I do it a little longer when I do Kansas history in class. Of course I do. I make my students write about mission stories and things like that. But if you're teaching American history and all you say during the Indian removal period is this, that's not a full story at all. And so that's why I think telling the story of the immigrant tribes is important. Certainly an important part of Kansas history. And so that's it. I could see lunch in your eyes, so I was determined.
I got a question.
I could feel the bell was going to ring at any point. Okay.
Ken, touch a little bit then on the tribes that were here, like the Kaw Nation and the others. And you talked about the conflict with the Osage that the Delaware had, which caused them to be moved. But talk about that kind of squeezing of the tribes that were already here when they moved these guys in and say, hey, this is your land. They didn't ask anybody here, right?
No. So you're talking about 1854?
Yeah.
So yeah, there's just,
earlier even.
Yeah, they're not asking anybody. And in 1854, they're not asking anybody. In Congress, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, they're drawing it up. Of course, that's the story of the country. It's the story of the country. They're drawing up lands and not asking the people who live in the lands anything. But the irony is they just signed, if you think about it, you just made all those deals. Think about it just totally legally, right? Supposedly you just made all those deals to move all those Native Americans to Kansas, and then without even saying a word, you go, oh, it's open for settlement. Popular sovereignty, let's go. Of course, that's unbelievable. And it's unbelievable that you don't think about that, right? And now there were some of those places, southeast Kansas, where some of those tribes didn't have settlers for a bit. You know, people, if I ever tell this story to people who study this, a lot of times they'll go, oh yeah, you know, southeast Kansas. They'll remember, you know, Ma and Pa Ingalls were there too early, weren't they? They'll remember things like that. And I get it, but that's true of the whole state, the whole territory. It's not true of that one spot. It's really true of the whole territory. The whole territory is pretty much claimed. So yeah, for sure. Yeah, Mike?
Well, just even the establishment of the Kansas Pacific Railroad, which is our current, is a story of chicanery and evil that was perpetrated against the Delaware. And, you know, that is one example of the many ills that were perpetrated against these people.
Yes. I like the word you used. Yeah, DK.
There's a picture out here of the four horsemen. One of them is Thomas Atkins. His name is misspelled. He was the agent for the Delawares from Fort Leavenworth, and he joined the Delawares where the Lawrence Airport is. There are teepees there that were used. That was for the Delawares. In 1867, they were the Custer and the scouts for the Hancock expedition.
Huh. Yeah.
They went back. Some of those warriors were in their 80s. So this whole transport, but they came back to the Lawrence area, and then I think most of them were removed a year after the Hancock expedition, after serving Hancock and 7th Cavalry.
That's very cool. I started by telling you that I have a farm in Oklahoma and that I'm kind of half Kansas and half Okie. My parents were called Okies. But think about how rich Kansas's Native American heritage is, you know, just like the Council Grove story and how, and then the Civil War, right? I didn't even touch on this. I talked about the immigrant tribes, but the Civil War and where I'm from and where my grandparents Spurgeon grew up near Fall River, the whole story of Opath-Leyahola and all of that, the creek, it's incredible. It's incredible. So, yeah, I know I have one more thing to say, but do you have any more questions? I'd love to. Yeah.
I thought part of this might be on Native American tribes that were moving into western Kansas from north and other areas, and not just from the New England states here. What can you tell about other tribes that were claiming parts of Kansas that were not pushed there by our legal systems?
It's a great question. D, this is for you this afternoon. No, it's a great question. I just didn't address it, but yeah, you have lots of tribes out here that are not at least on a drawn up reservation. Certainly the Cheyenne and many others that are moving, and there are collisions. In fact, when Deb spoke this morning, that's an example right there of a collision between. You mentioned the Cheyenne and the Kaw. As I mentioned, the Osage. I just kind of I since I focused on the period, you know what I mean, between 1829 and 1854, that's primarily east to central, but no, it's happening here too, for sure.
And I realized where you're going, but I was just curious about touching that little bit of history of what happened out there, the different tribes that claimed it, and but not just in Kansas, big deals, but other areas of the West.
Sure. Did you have your hand up, D?
Yeah, that Cherokee that's marked there on that map became known as the Cherokee Outlet. And you want to talk about treaties and the movements, and there's a huge story right there.
Yeah.
Just on that section right there. And it's even related to now, to today, because the Creeks, the Supreme Court
Sure.
2 years ago ruled that the Creeks still own their land.
Right.
And right where it says Creek and where it says Cherokee, right along that line, part of that there's a little triangle of land right there that I think the current Southern Cheyenne tribe could lay claim to, and the Supreme Court has said that the U.S. government doesn't own that land.
So I didn't mean to do that, Chance. I was going to go back to a map real quick. I'm going to say something. I did want to. I'm going to go back up here to an earlier map, since we're just before we break. This, sorry. This map, which is like, to me, it's super important. This map, to the discussion of the misunderstanding of native tribes, you're not, if you're going to do this, don't put people next to each other that do not get along. And that was just done time and time again. There's just no thought to who they are and where they come from and who their relatives are, who their cousins are, what language do they speak. This would be things you'd want to think about and were not thought about. And then I just was thinking about this because what you're talking about the creek, I mentioned the comment about the Pawnee earlier, but you might want to know who's got a rivalry with each other too. The Cherokee, speaking of the Cherokee, the whole John Ross, the division that goes back to the Indian Removal Act of 1830, that still really is kind of around, and definitely Elias Boudinot and all that. The government just never took the time to understand any of that or care to understand any of that, and that caused more and more and more trouble. And so, so we could talk about that for a lot, because that's a big deal. But your question about Western Kansas is a good one. Western Kansas is kind of unregulated at this period, for the most part. I know we're going to go, but since Deb mentioned it, there's a totally different subject, but I'll take 1 minute. So we're doing a film this summer called Sod and Stubble, and there's some brochures over there if you want to grab a brochure. That's more of the tour of the story, but it's based on a book called Sod and Stubble. So, but anyway, thank you all very much.
Ken, on behalf of the Fort Wallace Memorial Association, we want to thank you not only for this presentation, but all you are doing to preserve Kansas history, to inform, enlighten, and inspire us. So thank you very much. Yeah. And then DK?
And Ken, I'd like to present you with the Dennis K. Clark Lecture Series again. And the inspiring and the informing, preserving. We've been on many trails, but what all you are doing, from Wichita and across the state. So
Thank you. Thank you, Dave.